Welcome to the SACNAS webinar. The mountains are calling and we can all go. Accessibility, inclusion, and innovation in the geosciences. My name is Daryl Monto and I'm the SACNAS Native Initiatives Manager. In this webinar, Dr. Anita Marshall will share her story and discuss accessibility and inclusion in geoscience. For our first-time attendees, welcome to SACNAS. We are an inclusive organization dedicated to achieving true diversity in STEM, where the field reflects the demographics of the population. As the nation's largest multicultural, multidisciplinary STEM diversity organization in the country, SACNAS creates space where all members, partners, and staff feel they belong and can embrace their intersexual identities. If you are not yet a member, we invite you to join. We'll be sharing several links in our chat feature. Membership gives you access to a welcoming community of like-minded students and professionals from all STEM disciplines, including the opportunity to connect with one of our 115 plus chapters across the country, eligibility to apply for programs specifically for each stage of your education and career, exclusive opportunities like jobs, internships, and more from our partners, and the opportunity to raise your voice for true diversity and inclusion in STEM. Again, you can sign up by visiting membership.sacnas.org. At the end of this webinar, we will host a Q&A session. You can submit your questions by using the Q&A or chat feature. Remember to always be polite and respectful to others with your comments. So now let's begin with the presentation. It is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Anita Marshall. Dr. Marshall is a lecturer and researcher in the Department of Geological Services at the University of Florida, Gainesville, and a member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma. Her primary research area is Geoscience Education with a focus on access and inclusion for underrepresented groups in STEM, especially people with disabilities. Dr. Marshall's work focuses on making experiential learning opportunities more accessible through programs like the Library of Inclusive Field Technology, also known as L.I.F.T, a lending library of tech tools that enables the participation of students with disabilities in field learning activities. Her geology research interests in volcanology, where Dr. Marshall utilizes near-surface geophysics to examine in eruptive deposits and the subsurface features of small volume volcanic eruptions. Dr. Marshall is also the Director of Operations for the nonprofit International Association for Geoscience Diversity, where she co-coordinates the day-to-day operations of the organization and serves as a mentor and advocate for geoscience students, faculty, and professionals with disabilities. Again, it is my pleasure to introduce Dr. Marshall, and I will turn it over to you.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm very excited to get to do my first SACNAS webinar. I'm relatively new to the SACNAS community, and after doing a presentation at a regional event a few months ago, I was asked to do this webinar. So for those of you who are joining me after meeting me at the regional meeting, thanks for tuning in again. And I look forward to fielding questions towards the end. So if you guys have, or if you all have anything that you're curious about, either in terms of accessibility or, you know, broader inclusion in the sciences, feel free to put those in the chat and we'll try to answer those towards the end. All right, so on this first slide is one of my favorite pictures from the last few years of fieldwork. This is in Western Ireland in the Connemara region. This was one of our accessible inclusive field trips where we had a group of students that were some that identified as disabled and some that did not, and we put them in collaborative teams, and we used tech and technology to bridge the access gap in some of the places that were too rugged for all of the students to reach. So before I get into a little bit about my research and what I do, I think it's very valuable, you know, especially for a SACNAS presentation, to talk a little bit about my family and my my private journey and how that informs my research, because it's all very much connected. So I am the first in my family to get a PhD. This is my little granny. She was born in Indian Territory and went to one of the notorious Indian schools where she was disencouraged from speaking Choctaw and from practicing native traditions. This fear of hers stayed with her her entire life, and she never spoke Choctaw in public after her teenage years, even doing one-sided conversations with her friends where they would still speak Choctaw and she would only reply in English. She felt that the safest thing to do for the family would be to disassociate ourselves from tribal traditions as much as possible and just try to assimilate. This is a picture of my grandma and her siblings in about 8th grade. This picture was taken just a few months before they all dropped out of school and got jobs. As my granny likes to say, high school didn't put food on the table. So, you know, their educational careers didn't go much further. This is my dad and my family, and we are rocking some serious 80s fashion in this picture. And he was the first in his family to go to college, and he did that through the GI Bill. He realized that there were very few opportunities in rural Oklahoma, and joined the military and was able to use that to go to college on the GI Bill and even get a 2-year graduate degree in a Master's of Divinity, which is a degree for ministers. He is a, now retired military chaplain, and he's still practicing the chaplaincy in the VA hospital system. So he's very much a role model for me. This is me and my this is me and my granny at my PhD graduation. So she died a few months after I graduated, but it was very fulfilling for all of us for her to get to come to my graduation. She never really understood my research or what I studied, but she was my biggest fan, and it meant a lot to my family. It was sort of a win for my whole family when I was able to get my PhD. It was sort of like the dreams of the entire family had been fulfilled. So that mentality of sort of making the way better for those behind you and trying to push the next group to do more than what you could do yourself very much plays into my philosophy in my work on trying to make the way better for those behind me, and trying to use my struggles in a constructive way to build a better path forward. So let's bring geology into the picture. When I was looking for universities, I was certainly not looking for a geology program. In fact, most people aren't. Geology is what's called a found major. What that means is that most people who major in geology do not go to school thinking they're going to be a geology major. They come in with some other degree in mind and usually find an introductory geology class that they get hooked, they change their majors, and the rest is history. That was very much my path, but I was very fortunate to accidentally choose a school with a great geology program, even though I had chosen it as a music education major. I will say the reason that I chose my undergrad institution, the University of Arkansas, is because they had entered in with the Oklahoma tribes along the Arkansas border to offer in-state tuition to all the tribal members. So that was a very big incentive to choose that school, and I'm very glad I did. Now, University of Arkansas is a very field-focused geoscience programs. So we were always going on field trips. Sometimes they were just during class time, sometimes, you know, over the weekends or a week long. And then geology has something called field camp, for those of you not familiar with the geosciences. And this is usually 6 weeks. It happens in the summer, and it's required for graduation in most programs. So in order to get a degree in geology, you have to be able and willing to sort of disappear into the wilderness for 6 weeks. Needless to say, this is not something that is doable for many people. And, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. I love fieldwork. To this day, fieldwork is still my absolute favorite part of geology. I love getting out and experiencing nature and learning more about how the earth works. And there's just something so amazing about that. And it's still my favorite part of geology. So I was spending all this great time in the field and loving what I was doing. And my career goals were to be a field geologist. I wanted to actually be a field technician and do field geology for a living. This all came to a sudden and abrupt halt my final year of my master's program, when I was struck as a pedestrian by a drunk driver. I was nearly killed in the accident, and I spent 2 months in the hospital and many months in reconstructive surgeries. And I spent about a year in a wheelchair and many more years of physical therapy to try to recover from that accident. This slide is intentionally left blank in the story. I do that because 7 years after my accident, when I started to apply to PhD programs, when I started, you know, when I wanted to get back on the track that I was missing, I didn't have very much to show for it in my CVs. You know, I didn't have those research experience. I didn't have field experience. I hadn't done anything in the geosciences other than adjunct at a community college part-time in all that time. So to me, I felt like this empty screen is essentially what program officers were seeing when I applied to universities. Just nothing. Like, what in the world have you been doing for the last 7 years? And you know, I can't say I had a lot of confidence in myself, but I felt like I was physically strong enough to at least take a shot at going back to school and trying to, you know, get back into the geosciences. I had applied and been rejected pretty spectacularly from a few places, and finally I was applying to my last round, or my third round of applications. I only applied to one place, and I told my husband that if I didn't get in, I wasn't going to try anymore. Like, I'd just find something outside of geology to do for the rest of my life. And I just put that dream to rest. Well, amazingly enough, they accepted me, even with the nothing in my CV for the last 7 years. And I was able to start a program at the University of South Florida. So this began an amazing new chapter for me in all kinds of new and exciting field work and science that I'd never had a chance to do before. I call this era the volcano ventures. And so I had entered with geoscience education and volcanology as the areas I was most interested in, and was able to jump in with the geophysical volcanology group. And so we use geophysical tools to study all kinds of volcanic features. So ground penetrating radar, gravity measurements, magnetic measurements, all kinds of things to get an idea of what's underneath the subsurface. This work was so much fun And I absolutely loved this aspect of geology, being able to almost magically see beneath the ground surface. But in the course of doing that work, I realized that some of my apprehension about coming back to geology as a person with a physical disability were not unfounded. And that not only were there colossal physical barriers to my being able to participate the way my friends and colleagues were participating, but there was an enormous social barrier. There was a stigma attached to disability that was the elephant in the room in just about every project that I participated in. The geosciences are a very it's a field that prides itself culturally on being outdoorsy and rugged and physically fit and sort of the adventurous type. And for people who don't fit that description, either, you know, because they have a disability, because they grew up in the city and haven't camped a day in their lives, there are all kinds of reasons why people don't fit that description. And when they don't, there can be some real cultural pushback. And I began to get more interested in that than even the volcanoes. I kept thinking, like, there's got to be a better way. There has to be some way to change this. And so I got very interested in looking at accessibility in the geosciences and how to make things better for people with disabilities. So part of when I started looking at the barriers to disability, I realized that my personal passion, fieldwork, was the single biggest barrier to degree completion for people with disabilities. The fact that they could not do field camp was one of the main reasons that students with disabilities were dropping out, or what we call self-selecting out of the geosciences, right? Giving up. No, I'm sorry, my dogs are up in my lap. I should have taken them to daycare. Anyway, the academic benefits of fieldwork are numerous. For one thing, it's the place where geologists can reinforce classroom concepts. We can practice problem solving in, you know, spatially complex settings. It's one thing to learn how geology works in a textbook, but quite another to apply that knowledge in a very complex natural setting. And we learn the field skills and data collection techniques that make us attractive to employers. So there are lots of academic benefits. But what's often overlooked are the social, or we call affective, benefits of fieldwork as well. One of these is that it turns out that fieldwork is a critical factor in forming an identity as a geoscientist. What that means is that fieldwork is how students start to feel like they are geologists. By completing field projects, it gives them the confidence and the identity of a geoscientist. People that are constantly left out of these experiential opportunities like fieldwork don't have the same opportunities to build that identity as a geologist. This can lead to people dropping out of the major and just not being as successful later on. It also develops social bonds with colleagues and mentors. This is really important to future career success. In the field is where we often meet lifelong friends. It's also where we work one-on-one in a very close setting with our faculty mentors, and find people who are willing to write us letters for graduate school or put us in on a research project. And a lot of those bonds are built in the field. So if you're not in the field, a lot of times you're missing out on that critical network building that is crucial for future success. So it also improves learning outcomes and future academic engagement. We learn a lot in the field, and it's one of those sort of accelerated learning environments. And very often, students with disabilities are excused or given alternate assignments that do not provide the same level of inquiry-based collaborative learning that their peers receive. So, making somebody write a paper instead of, going to the mountains and learning how to field map, they're not going to get the same impact from that. They're just not. So there has to be, a better way. During my PhD, I was able to do research on this topic. And in one of the interviews with a student with a disability, this amazing quote came out of one of the focus group interviews. And here a student is saying, what a lot of us are saying is because we have a disability, that might have changed our educational background. There have been courses I haven't been able to take. I've been told because there's one big field experience, I can't take the course. And I decided not to fight. So we have to make these decisions. We have these different backgrounds in geoscience, often because of our disability. To me, as an educator now, every time I read this quote, it hurts my stomach. The fact that we are intentionally excluding a group of students from our core educational activity is not acceptable. And to me, one of the biggest reasons this is not acceptable is because roughly 20% of the population has a disability. And when we say of the population, this actually holds true across all demographics. If you look at any subset of women, of Black people, of any minority group, roughly 20 to 24% of that group will have some sort of disability. So when we exclude people with disabilities from our big, important learning and bonding activity in our discipline, we're still telling 20% of any group that this science is not for them. And that's part of why I'm so passionate about this work, is because this is at its core one of the obstacles to diversifying the geosciences. So during my PhD, I was able to do most of this work through a fantastic project called Engaging Students in Inclusive Experiences via On-Site and Remote Partnerships. This was an NSF-funded project that I was a PhD researcher on. Now, as an aside, if there are any students listening, I always like to take this opportunity to encourage you to take your shot if you see an opportunity. So while I was working on my PhD, there came a point where I was really struggling. I was really struggling to feel like I belonged. I was struggling enough that I was considering dropping out and leaving my PhD program. One of my friends heard about this NSF project and sent me the contact information for the lead researchers and encouraged me to email them. The contact information was for an undergrad recruitment. It was basically to recruit students to be the trial group for this new project of using technology to bridge the access gap in the geosciences. So I contacted the lead researchers, and this was either, I always tell people this was either the bravest thing I've ever done or the most ridiculous thing I've ever done, because I had never met these people ever. And I just sent them an email out of the blue. And I just said, I'm not an undergrad. I'm a grad student, and I would like to be a researcher on your project. I gave them some background on myself, what I was interested in looking at, and what I thought I could bring to the project. And these are people I had never met before. And I'm just like, this is just a shot in the dark. And they got back to me and they said, it sounds like you were born for this project. And it was so amazing to feel that connection. Like, oh my gosh, they actually want me on this project. And it was sort of the beginning of a long and beautiful friendship with the researchers on this project. And I still work with many of them, you know, now, even though I'm a faculty member, we still do projects together. And so a few points that I would like to hit on some of the big outcomes that we found after doing a few years of these accessible geology field trips. We were able to connect with a group in the United Kingdom that had also been working on accessible geology field trips using technology. So we were able to look at a whole bunch of these experiences and try to do an analysis of all of these projects and pull out the big so whats that I call them, right? The big outcomes. Like, what are the big tips that, you know, that we have been able to discern after looking at across all of these trips and all of these experiences. So we did this by using the 5 core practices of inclusive learning communities. So these are the 5 things that are outlined in a really cool paper by Fink and Hummel, 2015, that outline any programs, any educational programs that are designed to be inclusive of many identities should have 5 core things in evidence. And so those 5 things are population-specific theory and research to inform your practice. What this means is that you need to do your homework. If you are working with students with disabilities, you need to be up on not just the geology that you're planning to teach them in the field, but also disability theory and, you know, the research dealing with disability and how that intersects with people's educational journeys and personal journeys. And so this is true of any group, right? You need to do your homework and you need to involve the people in those groups. You're not going to have a successful inclusive program as a group of outsiders trying to, you know, do this project for another group. You need to have buy-in from that group. You need to have experts from the groups that you're trying to reach deeply involved in the design and execution of the project. The second one is fostering students' bond to each other and a sense of belonging to the class or the group. I cannot emphasize enough how much social outcomes impact educational outcomes. If a student feels like they don't belong in a group, they are really going to struggle to contribute to group activities or even to really apply themselves as hard as they could when they feel like an outsider. So it is really important to actively culture that group connection, that sense of team. The third one is engaging students as active learners in the geosciences. This is one of the things that I'm always harping on people who get very excited about our use of technology in the field. For instance, one of the things that we do is we have portable wireless hotspots that we can set up in field sites and give all the students ruggedized iPads, and they can live stream with each other from all different places in the field. So you can have students working in more and less accessible locations and collaborating together in real time. This is a fantastic tool for inclusion. But it is very easy to fall into the trap of passive engagement. So if you have a group of students that's out in the field doing all this cool science, and then you have another group that is sitting back, say at some sort of base camp, if all they're doing is watching their teammates do field work, that's not enough to build that sense of community, and it's not enough to really get them those meaningful learning outcomes that they need. It's not really enough to learn how to do field science. So you have to think of ways to actively engage the group. They have to be integral to the activities that are going on. There has to be a two-way connection there, not just a one-way connection. Like I tell people, if it was as easy as just handing an iPad to a student with a disability and calling it good, you could just leave them at home to watch Discovery Channel, right? Like they'd get probably more out of it than watching a feed on an iPad. So active engagement is really important. The fourth one is creating positive messages of achievement and change. So this has to do with that retention and long-term success idea, that as the project is progressing and even after your field course is over, it's important to focus on what the group accomplished, what you were able to do, and how that makes a difference beyond just the field course you just participated in. This really cultivates that sense of belonging and that sense of accomplishment that can increase students' sense of belonging and long-term retention to a discipline. So the fifth is advocating on behalf of the student constituency towards systematic improvement through the broader community. This is probably one of my favorite aspects of this. If you are going to work on inclusive activities, where you're actively trying to build a diverse group, it's important that the members of that group feel like it's not just performative, that you are advocating for the systemic change that's needed to increase the participation of more people like them. So being actively involved in systemic change and helping those students become engaged in that change is very meaningful to these projects as well. Okay, so here are a few things that we learned when we applied these concepts of inclusive learning communities to these accessible field experiences. One is that social inclusion is closely linked to academic engagement. It was very clear from the interviews that we did with students on these projects that their sense of belonging was directly tied to their level of academic engagement. They applied themselves more and did better work when they felt like they were an accepted part of the team and that they were accepted as their whole selves, not just there to do the science, but they really felt like they were personally accepted into the group. The formation of group identity, team goals, and individual roles all impact academic engagement. So this kind of playing off that first one. One of the things that we found is most successful when using these tech-enabled approaches is to build that sense of identity, right? To build that sense of teamwork, and that you're not just an individual, you are a team. So you're doing this for yourself, but then you're also doing this for your teammates. For example, we found that students were much more engaged and did much more detailed, higher quality field surveys when they had other team members who could not reach those same field sites, and they knew that they were collecting data not just for themselves but for their teammates. So there was this extra bit of engagement when you could really form that team identity, and where the goals were not just personal goals but team goals as well. Decisions about participation should always be made with student involvement. This is so important when working with students with disabilities. It is not okay to simply decide for the student what they can and cannot do. Disability is a very wide spectrum, and students deserve to be involved in the decisions on what they can and cannot do in the field. This is where innovation comes in. If they want to participate, then it is up to us as instructors to create ways to make that happen in a meaningful way. But they should always be part of this conversation, and the earlier the better, right? Understanding their needs and how best to participate, all of that is important. And I'll say as an aside at this point, here in the US, you cannot compel your students to disclose a disability to you. If they don't want to disclose, they don't have to. The ways that, so it's important for us as instructors to foster the kind of environment, and this happens long before fieldwork, right? Back in the classroom and in our departments. It's important for us to foster the kind of inclusive environment where students feel safe disclosing this information to us so that we can help them participate in the best way possible. By safe, I mean that they won't feel like they're at risk of negative treatment when it comes out that they have a disability. This is still very much an issue in a lot of geoscience departments, and there are a lot of people with disabilities, myself included, who have literally physically hurt ourselves trying to downplay or hide the fact that we have a disability, because that stigma is still so strong in some places. So it's up to us as educators to foster the kind of environment where people feel safe disclosing, where they know that they can disclose that they have a disability and they won't be negatively impacted for that. So if we think about that fifth thing, the advocates for change that extend well beyond the program. This was a cool quote from the Geopark Project that I was involved in during my PhD. And one of the students without a disability said that getting the perspective that they didn't have before, where there's no allowance for having a disability. You're just left with this hollow version of a field experience. And I was like, we need to change this. There's stuff we can do, and I can put other people's experience with this field site ahead of me getting to look at the 17th recumbent fold for today. That's a metamorphic rock thing for the non-geos on the call. It's getting that perspective and carrying that forward into the way we act that I thought was a really interesting and valuable part of this experience. So this is a student that has realized through first-person experience that the way we treat people with disabilities in the geosciences is not okay. And this student went on to become quite a vocal advocate for accessibility back in their home institution. Even though they themselves did not have a disability, they became quite a vocal advocate for change. There were lots of other cool things, and this project specifically continues to just have so much momentum in terms of advocates for change. We had our students present a poster. Well, we didn't have them. They wanted to present a poster about their experiences and how the technology was different from, say, traditional field journals. And they did this beautiful poster. Well, one of their members had to go home early. So without even asking any of those of us on the project, they just innovated. They got out a tablet, they got on the Wi-Fi, they set up a tablet in front of their poster so that their teammate could present the poster alongside them. So they used what they learned about collaboration and teamwork and technology during our project to allow a remote teammate to participate in presenting their poster at the conference. And I just thought that was really cool. We had a student who was inspired to stop hiding her disability after one of the projects and started her own blog. This is the blog Type 1 Geologist, and it is a blog to try to share wisdom and experiences for people doing field science in remote areas with type 1 diabetes. And this is a very entertaining blog, and I would highly recommend it, especially for those of you who may be diabetics. Type 1 Geologist is a great blog. Several of us have written papers together. So this is me and one of my mentees. We just published an article in Yoast Magazine, which is a magazine for the American Geophysical Union, and it's all about creating spaces for geoscientists with disabilities to thrive. So this project just keeps going and going and going on that advocates for change, and it's really created this amazing momentum around changing the dialogue on who can and can't participate in the geosciences. So a lot of this work was instrumentally tied to an organization called the International Association for Geoscience Diversity. So I'll give them a quick plug here as we wrap up. They are a group that's been around for about 12 years now. I've been closely involved for the last 3 as the director of operations. And they do a lot of this work, not just on the field trips, but on advocacy and trying to change this narrative in the geosciences. And I'll say that, you know, of all the very important work that the IAGD does, what it's done for me personally was during my PhD, I felt very isolated and alone. I felt like I must be the only geologist trying to do this with a physical disability. And connecting with this group made me realize that I'm not alone. There's a whole community of us out there. And the support network that I've been able to build through the IAGD is invaluable to me and continues to be invaluable to me. So, you know, I'm so happy that I was able to find this group. For those of you who are interested in the technological approach to access barriers, we have a new grant that I'm the lead PI on called the L.I.F.T Kit, the Library of Inclusive Field Tech. We are currently in the purchasing and website building phase, but we hope to have this up and running sometime in the fall. And this will allow schools and organizations to contact us and borrow our really cool technology to do their own field trips. So if you have a student with a disability who needs improved access, but your school can't pony up the dough for all the cool tech, you can contact us and we can give you the tools and expertise to deploy this in a meaningful way. So I'm really, really excited about this project. We're just now getting it off the ground. All right, so I think we'll wrap up now so that we have time for a few questions. Just some key points to reiterate here at the end. Collaboration is a powerful means for inclusion and leads to stronger research. So building that social bond with your group is really important. Social inclusion cannot be separated from academic inclusion in success. Everybody needs to feel welcome in your group. Every part of your science can make you stronger. Everything from my family's history to my own challenges with recovery and physical disability informs how I do my science, and I think makes me a stronger scientist. So don't be afraid to embrace your whole self in your science, to bring all of you into your work and your research. And if you can't see an obvious fit for you, I encourage you to blaze your own trail. There really was not a PhD path in what I eventually had my PhD in, you know, disability studies in the geosciences, and make the way easier for those behind you. Take your struggles, take your challenges, and channel them into a way to make things better for other people. Right. So I think that's all I have for now, and I really thank you guys for tuning in today, and I'm happy to take a few questions as we wrap up.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Marshall. That was such a wonderful and informative presentation. I know that I truly appreciate that, and I did learn quite a bit from this. Right now, we are open to taking any questions through the chat feature or through the Q&A feature. If anyone has any questions directly for Dr. Marshall. Also, in the chat, we've shared a couple of links. The Type 1 Geologist link was shared, the blog was shared on there, and then also Dr. Marshall's Twitter information was shared as well. And I know that there was one person that had asked if we might be able to put together a resource list of the materials that you've shared, Dr. Marshall, and you may already have something like that available. So
Sure. And what I can do is, if you're planning on making a recording available, we can, like, I can attach that list to whatever email you send out. I can send you
sure.
the links, and then you can just send it all out together.
Okay. Yeah, no problem. We can do that. Okay. So we have one question pop up in the Q&A. And this is, the question is, I'm a middle school science teacher, and is the L.I.F.T program including K through 12 schools?
Yes. Although when we initially pitched the idea, it was for colleges and universities, I don't see any reason why it would be exclusive to that group. Because goodness knows K through 12 have tight budgets as well. So.
Sure. Okay. Another question came in. Thank you so much. Would you be able to give some examples of the kinds of technology solutions you've developed?
Sure. So a lot of our solutions are needs dependent. So we look at the goals and objectives of the particular project, who's involved and their unique access needs, and we design accordingly. So with the portable Wi-Fi that I mentioned earlier, that works really well in locations where you have people with physical limitations, but you have a site that has a range of accessibility. So in this case, you know, on this last picture here, we're in the Irish bog in Connemara on the western side of Ireland, and there's an old railroad cut through the rocks. This was a fantastic place for our students with either in wheelchairs or mobility limitations to field map those rocks while their peers hiked out through the bog and mapped some of the less accessible things. And then we used a digital mapping app so that they were able to collaboratively build a structural field map together. So this was a great way to involve everybody across the entire field site by setting up this Wi-Fi network so they could all collaborate in real time. There are some places where drones work very well for access, where you might not be able to physically walk, but you could deploy a drone and do a 3D survey, or you know, if you're lucky enough to have a magnetometer on your drone, you could do some geophysics. But drones can be a great tool as well. There are all kinds of cool ways to make this accessible. And I will say that I like to call this the high-tech, low-tech, no-tech mentality. It doesn't matter how much tech you have. There are always solutions to inclusion. There are always, if you think outside the box, if you think outside the traditional way we've always done it, there are always ways to improve accessibility in any situation. Right? It may be as old school as somebody, you know, bringing rock samples back to somebody who can't get up to where you guys are working. But there's always a way to improve accessibility, regardless of the level of tech at your disposal. But tech doesn't hurt.
All right. So we've got more questions coming in. This one actually is coming from the UK. The question is, where there are multiple mandatory field trips throughout the entire course, although students can have exemptions, what are your thoughts on making all trips accessible versus having a minimum number that are?
So I'm very passionate about this for personal reasons. So of course my gut is to say, like, make them all accessible. I know that's just not feasible for a lot of geoscience departments. I feel like their core field trips. So all geoscience departments know what their formative field trips are, right? You have that handful of field trips that are really important. Those all need to be accessible. And I will say that, like, without hesitation. I don't care how cool the science is in whatever remote place you go to. If it's not accessible, if you're limiting the number of people who can participate, by its inaccessibility, then you need to reassess where you go on that field trip. There are very few things in geology that you can only see in one place on the entire planet. There's almost always a more accessible location, right? But it takes the effort and will to change and really take a hard look at where and why you do these field trips.
Another question comes in. Are you aware of similar initiatives or programs in other field-based sciences such as field biology, archaeology, etc.?
Not really. In fact, I've already had a few people in field biology contact me about this kind of stuff, because there doesn't really seem to be anything in their fields that are looking at these kinds of issues. There has been some archaeology work on improving access for people with disabilities. Most of it has had to do with improving physical access to dig sites through, ramps and things like that. But not that I'm aware of.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right, another question. Do you have any particular suggestions or thoughts on how geology departments and universities can structurally change to improve accessibility and inclusion? Example, would not requiring field camp for graduation be a good suggestion, or is there a different or a better way to implement structural shifts?
Yeah, boy, I could spend another hour talking about this one. Like, don't get me started. But so the issue of field camp. The challenges with anything addressing field camp is that it's not just part of our curriculum. It is such a cherished social and cultural touchstone in our discipline that any talk about changing or getting rid of it, and people stop listening. They just, that's just a bridge too far. So it all depends on how willing people are on this. But one of the things that I like to stress is that our obsession with having people have field camp or not be able to graduate is not aligned to the modern geoscience workforce. It's an old model that was invented back in the oil boom days when people used to go out and field map, and all you needed was like a good pair of hiking boots and a compass and a rock hammer. But that's not how we do geology anymore. Most of geology jobs are desk jobs. They use geophysics, they use satellites, they use all this high-tech equipment to do their work, and very few people in professional geology settings do field work on a regular basis. So to me, there's a fundamental mismatch in the requirements in the academic setting and what kinds of jobs we're preparing them for. And I think if we want to realign our departments in a more meaningful way, we need to look at it that way. What is the industry like now in the modern era, and how can we best prepare our students for that? Not everybody needs to tromp around in the mountains for 6 weeks, although it's, pretty fun. But, sometimes, what if they're going to be a lab scientist? What if they're going to be a geophysicist and do computer models all day? There are other very viable alternatives to field camp that could lead to a very successful geology degree, geology career.
Well, I have a couple more questions and then we'll wrap up. This one is asking, can I ask how the NSF program of which you program of which you participated defined disability? And then they go on to state visible physical disabilities are often noticed, but there are so many other types of disabilities that are not always understood or respected.
That's right. And I will say that the project that I participated in, it had a very narrow target to students with physical disabilities. So it did not target students with neurodiversity, with sensory disabilities. It was only for students with physical disabilities. And that was because of the methods that they were trying to develop. Those methods were specifically targeted at lack of site access in terms of like physical barriers. Now, there have been some other projects that the IAGD has been involved in that are targeted more broadly or specifically towards target groups like autism, sensory disabilities, and that sort of thing. And there are upcoming projects that'll be more broad in nature, but that particular project was very narrowly defined as physical limitations.
Okay. Okay. And let's see, I got 2 more questions for you, and then we'll wrap up. Can you talk for a moment about the different ways you've set up and scaffolded group dynamics? For example, you have 2 or 3 students all making a map together. How is the work divided up between those who may be less mobile? How is that set up for those who are more mobile, focused on making specific measurements?
Right. So this all depends on the location and the learning goals, right? Like what you're trying to, what the students are supposed to be getting out of the learning activity. We tried in the Geopath project several different formats. The one that seemed to work the best were these groups of 4, where you had teams of 2 that were always together in whatever location. But, sometimes that group of 4 would split off into more and less accessible locations. Sometimes they were doing equal work. In the case of the site in Western Ireland where we were field mapping out in the bog, there wasn't like a base camp and an away team where like the away team was doing all the work and the base camp was sort of interpreting it. Now, there were other places where we did use that model. But the reason I liked this particular model is because both teams were doing the same work. One team just happened to be doing it along the road cuts, right? The same sort of field mapping, the same photos and measurements as the students were doing out in the bog. They were all doing the same work, just in more and less accessible locations. So there was no difference in the type of field work or activities that were going on. Now, sometimes that's not possible. There was one place we went where the one outcrop was this cool, like glacial deposit type outcrop. And there was only the one, and it was super inaccessible. So only the more mobile students could get to that site. So in that case, and the weather was horrible. So the students with disabilities literally had to stay in the vans with the doors shut to even hear like on the radios what their teammates were saying. So they were completely isolated from the field site. And in that location, what was cool is that was towards the end of the project where the group dynamic was already really strong. And so the parts of the groups that were left in the vans were very comfortable guiding what was going on at the field site. They could, the teams in the field could hold up the iPads and they could hear their teammates saying like, can you hold that up to the left or zoom in and take a picture of that? What is that weird thing off to the right? And they were guiding their teammates in the field. And so even though they weren't physically there, they were still working as a team. Even though they weren't physically all in the same spot. So those dynamics, it all depends on your field site, on how you're going to set that up.
Okay, all right. Well, at this time, we are going to wrap up. Again, I want to thank Dr. Marshall for taking time out of her schedule to be with us and present today. And if you have any additional questions or would like to connect with one another after this webinar, we invite you to continue the discussion in our online community. You can follow the link in the chat window to sign up to become a member. And then also there's information on how to get involved with the online community. And also you can also find upcoming and previous webinars on our website at sacnas.org/webinars. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar. In the next few minutes, you will receive an email with a brief survey. I encourage you to provide feedback on today's program and suggestions for future webinars. This concludes our webinar for today. Thank you again, Dr. Marshall, for your taking time and for your support for our SACNAS community. And we'll see everyone at the next webinar. Have a good day.